You know, I'm still just kind of trying to process this whole thing, like that this video with this title is a thing that has actually happened. I've loved Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door for so many years. I honestly think it's one of the finest games Nintendo has ever crafted, but it really feels like Nintendo themselves have felt the opposite about it. Over the years, the way the Mario franchise has gone, it almost seems like they're ashamed of what this game represents. Like the fact that a game with a decently compelling story, fun characters, deep, complex gameplay, and a unique feel and tone were all things that had become antithetical to what Paper Mario was supposed to be, and were problems that needed to be fixed. At least that's how it felt. While Super Paper Mario did keep a lot of the identity that made Paper Mario what it was, it also drew the first blood in its downfall and stripped away the traditional gameplay that made this series stand out amongst the RPG genre. A few years later, Sticker Star came around and tore out anything else redeemable, leaving the franchise as a husk of its former self that has kind of just persisted in that state ever since. Even Origami King, a game that many people who aren't me enjoy, is still built on Sticker Star's skeleton, which kind of cemented in my mind that a true return to form was never going to happen, and that the Paper Mario series that I loved was gone forever. I have literally never been so happy to be proven wrong. Yeah, the 2023 September Direct has probably gone down as having my absolute favorite moment in Nintendo Direct history, with the announcement of a full remake of Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door. And while I definitely was skeptical about a few things, this was, at least in some way, an attempt by Intelligent Systems and Nintendo to actually do right by Paper Mario and give people who never had Gamecubes a chance to experience what I know this series is capable of being. And considering this game originally came out about 20 years ago, I know I'm dying of old age as we speak. So are you. There is an enormous group of people who have never owned anything that Thousand Year Door could even run on, so remaking it for the Switch to bring it up to modern standards and a new audience made perfect sense to me. And here it is in my hands. I can't wait to play it and experience the magic all over again. I even got this cool little slipcover for a pre-order. I guess it does pay to be Canadian every once in a while, eh? But there are a few things I do need to cover first. I'm going to be approaching this video as a review of the remake, going over the changes, how it looks, how it plays, that sort of thing. This is still a review of the game, but I won't be going nearly as deep as I usually would, but there will be some spoilers for the game throughout. Now, if you wanted a more in-depth dive as to what makes Thousand Year Door so great in my eyes, well, luckily for you, I already made that video. Here it is. Anyways, without further ado, let's start talking about the remake of Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door. And before we get started, if you like what I do, like the video and maybe subscribe to the channel. If you want to go above and beyond, you can even join my Patreon, where you'll get these videos a week in advance, get exclusive updates, and even get the occasional exclusive video. Alright, plug over. So the game starts out with a little intro scene to tell the story of the Thousand Year Door itself. That long ago there used to be a successful and prosperous town that, over the course of a single night, was completely wiped off the face of the earth. Over the years that town was lost to time and fell into legend, and whatever destroyed it, being equally forgotten, morphed over time into a tale of great treasure. I already really loved this intro because it sets a tone that you don't really see in the Mario franchise that often. It's taking itself somewhat seriously here and establishing a history for the world that typically is entirely ignored. Rogueport isn't just another Mario level that popped out of nowhere, it's got a lot of history, and that isn't just surface deep. That ancient civilization's ruins are still around, making up a ton of the town's sewers. And the Tale of Treasure attracted the type of people who would want a way to make a quick buck: criminals, ne'er-do-wells, and scallywags. The remake's version of this is so much more effective though, because it lets us experience the Cataclysm a bit more directly. It really leans into the pop-up storybook feel, and it just looks so good. Once that's established, we then move to the present, where we see Princess Peach exploring Rogueport on her own, which has never gone wrong before. She talks to a sketchy salesperson to open a strange box, which supposedly contains a map to the town's treasure, and since this was apparently true, she sends the map to Mario, who then immediately heads out to help her find it. After landing in Rogueport and fighting off some goons, Mario learns that Peach has disappeared, which is an incredibly shocking development no one could have ever seen coming, and decides to go search for her following the map she gave him along with his new partner Goombella. After a quick intro and some skippable tutorials, Mario and Goombella head off on their adventure. And now that we're in Rogueport, I think it's time we talk about one of the most important changes to the remake from the original, and one of the things that I was the most hesitant about when I first saw the reveal trailer: the visual design and graphics. Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door on Gamecube holds up really well in my eyes. The sprites were all really well drawn and animated, the environments were unique and interesting, and as a whole it's just so dang charming. It took the style established in the N64 original and built on it in all the right ways, being a lot more ambitious and setting the standard that the next two games of the series would be built off of. Now, because it holds up so well on its own, I didn't think it would need much to be brought to modern systems and still look really good. Honestly, just increasing the resolution of the textures like the texture packs on Dolphin do would have been enough for me to be happy with it. However, Intelligent Systems decided to do a whole lot more than that, really revolutionizing the game's visuals and pushing what they could do on the Switch for the remake. I was kinda mixed on the look of the game during those early trailers, but it has definitely grown on me. I love how much more detailed everything is. The original game had a lot of flat textures without much detail, which is one of the reasons why it has managed to stand the test of time so well, but later games in the series have pushed the paper aesthetic much farther and were able to realize it much more effectively and realistically, to a fault in some instances. The remake pulls from those more modern graphical aesthetics and manages to combine it with a Thousand Year Door's style incredibly well. Trees are no longer flat sprites, they're now a series of interlocking layers. Ledges, doorways, and other things like that will have small imperfections where the edges don't quite line up, and the textures that make up each object are so much more detailed and so much more visually engaging. But despite how much has changed from the original, I never saw anything that felt out of place, nothing that stood out to me as not being the Thousand Year Door or whatever. You know, when people play a new version of a game, sometimes they'll say something along the lines of, "Wow, this looks exactly like I remember the original." Well, it's not quite the same situation here, but it is really close. There were several times when I was playing through this game that I wasn't really recognizing that I was playing the Thousand Year Door remake. I was just playing the Thousand Year Door, and that's about as high praise as I can levy against a remake that has as much riding on it as this does. That being said, there were a few things that I did find to be particularly striking about the new visual upgrades here, the character sprites being a big one. I really like how the character sprites are now seemingly made out of really thin 3D models, which maintains the original feel but gives them just a bit more depth than they had originally. It really makes them pop and lets their animations feel more smooth without having to draw more actual sprites. Well, for the most part, Vivian's hat is in a constant state of quantum leap, and that really only stands out because of how smooth everything else is. The partners were also given a ton more expressions as well, and I really love that. Sure, the original sprites were fine, but the fact that they decided to make the partners more expressive in important moments does a ton to make them even more likable than they already were. There's even back sprites now too. I also like that the NPCs were given sprites for when you hit them with a hammer now, so Mario can go full bad guy and beat up bystanders who don't deserve it. Also Podly, who does. Menus have also been completely revamped, which does a lot more than just look nice, but yes, they do look nice. They fit in really well with the new visual identity of the game and make quite a few things more convenient for the player along the way. So overall, I would say that the visual overhaul is a slam dunk, but I do have one nitpick to bring up. One moderately warm take that I've had from the second I saw the first trailer, the fact that everything is so dang shiny. That being said, this issue is a lot more situational than I thought it would be. For instance, Chapter 2, Boggly Woods, uses the shininess of the ground in an incredibly effective way. The ground in Chapter 2 has always had this multicolor look to it, but turning that into a sort of prismatic reflection off the ground just is absolutely incredible. I have similar praise for Chapter 4's Twilight Town. The reflections that are used here are so much more diffuse, and combining that with the texture of the ground creates a really stylish look that fits the chapter super well. My problem is Rogueport, at least half of it. See, Rogueport is a city that is split into two halves. The west side, which is buoyed by the Pianta family organized crime syndicate, is relatively nice and has a lot more bougie amenities like the XS Express and the Game Corner. It makes perfect sense for this part of the town that is well maintained and clean to have a nice reflective look to it. It reflects the side of town really well, pun certainly not intended. However, the east side of Rogueport is what happens when organized crime takes over a town. Anyone not in their their good graces is left destitute, their communities falling into disarray due to the resources being withheld from them. This part of town is supposed to be dirty, grimy, unwelcoming, and that feeling simply doesn't come across when everything is polished to a sheen. Like, yeah, this part of town is still filled with trash, graffiti, crime scenes, and actual literal noose, things like that, but one of the best things about Rogueport, including its sewers, was its atmosphere and how completely different it was to basically anything Mario had ever been. And that atmosphere would have been much, much stronger without the shine. Staying in the realm of the presentation, we also get an entirely new set of sound design and music to go along with the remake, and I have to say that overall it's mostly good with, again, some nitpicks. On the music side of things, it's almost entirely great. The soundtrack has been remade and expanded on with so much care and respect while not being afraid to take things in new directions to fit the game better. This is most noticeable with the new partner themes, my favorite of course being Bobbery's, and the area-specific battle themes, which are pretty much all great, but peak in chapters 5 and 7 for me. Oh, and I absolutely adore the new rendition of Rogueport's theme. It goes way harder than it ever needed to. It's not all awesome, as I think music made for Glitzville and the Glitz Pit are straight up misses here. On top of not really matching the atmosphere that the original game was going for, it really should be more Gold Saucer than Shogun Studios. I honestly don't think they sound that good, period. Now, if you hate the idea of change, you can very easily swap back to the original soundtrack using the newly added Nostalgic Tunes badge. I really appreciate this addition. I think that anytime a game is remade like this and the music is changed, including the original OST should be mandatory. As a whole, this is really good, but it's really strange how they handled the sound test for it. You can only access songs from the current set of music in the sound test, so if you don't have the Nostalgic Tunes badge on, you can't pick out those older songs and vice versa. I don't understand why they did this, it just makes it way more difficult for people who want to compare the new and old music to actually do so. I also feel like this would have been harder to program, so like why do it at all? Anyways, the rest of the sound design is more or less fine in my opinion. I do have a few small nitpicks, but probably the only one worth mentioning is the fact that hecklers don't scream when they run away from the stage anymore, which was a change that didn't really need to happen at all. Another thing that some people may have an issue with is the new character dialogue sounds. Basically, every main character has their own gibberish sound when they're talking, and I think it's fine. It's a kind of weird middle ground between the straight text sounds of the original and something like Banjo-Kazooie's pure nonsense talking. I feel like this was a good compromise between the two, as while I did think the original was perfectly acceptable, it does give the characters a bit more personality while talking, and that is always welcome. All in all, I think the presentation is largely an upgrade over the original, and I'm hugely impressed with how far they decided to go with the visual and audio overhauls here. It looks and sounds phenomenal, and most of the issues I have are personal taste things, not actual problems that detract from the game. And frankly, that's about as good a result as I could have ever hoped for, so congratulations Intelligent Systems, you've completely succeeded here. That's not to say it's entirely an upgrade, and I think it's about time I start talking about something I'm not as wholly positive about, the actual gameplay. Let's start with the good stuff, because there really is a ton of it. So, Thousand Year Door is an RPG that, despite being a part of the Mario universe, doesn't really lean into the signature platforming gameplay all that much. There is a little bit, but exploration here is much slower and more relaxed than you'd expect in the mainline Mario series. Because of that, Mario controls significantly differently here, and while I always found it to be fine in the context context of the game, if there's anything that you could easily criticize about the game's exploration and movement, it's that it is pretty slow. Especially if you're directly comparing it to the N64 original, which while being just as slow as a baseline, at least had the spin to drastically increase Mario's speed to let him get around faster. Well, if there's anything that Intelligent Systems took away from the discussions about this game throughout the years, it was that, and they've done a ton to make the experience of moving through the world significantly smoother, more intuitive, and less backtracky than it originally was. I noticed this from the very beginning, and I'm not sure how many other people have, but Mario's base movement speed has been increased, and while it's not a big change, this adds up and makes getting around feel a bit quicker than it used to, as well as letting you actually get away from enemies if you don't want to fight them. Changing partners is now a breeze thanks to the new partner wheel, and honestly, I didn't know how much I needed this here until I started playing. Like, it wasn't super tedious to swap partners around in the original, but it's so much quicker and easier now, and that lets you get back to the action way faster. On the topic of partners, there have been a few small changes to how they work too. For instance, getting on and off of the Yoshi is way faster than it was originally, and this made me so much more likely to use him to get around in even small areas, whereas in the original, the animation of getting on and off took so long that it wasn't always worth it. And the attempts to speed up the game's pace has even been applied to the level design and world. In the original, there were only 4 fast travel warp pipes to the different chapters, which I kinda did understand. I assume that in the developers' minds, chapters 3, 4, and 7 didn't need warp pipes because they all effectively had them in Rogueport, with the blimp to Glitzville, Twilight Town's pipe, and the hidden warp in the sewer town. But this was a pretty clunky solution and did leave one major blind spot. There was no easy way to get to Far Outpost. If you ever needed to get there, you just had to do the entire run from the pipe in Rogueport all the way every time, which wasn't great. They've entirely reworked the warp zone for the remake, pulling directly from Origami King's warp pipes now. Now, all 7 main chapters have warp pipes that go to important areas that open up immediately after using the respective crystal star on the Thousand-Year Door. This is definitely a lot better and does a ton to help out not only with a certain mustachioed Bob-Omb's quest, but side questing in general. There's a ton of troubles that require going back and forth between areas, and it's a breeze now that each area is just a warp pipe away. And on that note, they didn't fix the trouble center. You can still only take one at a time. That was literally my biggest complaint with the original. You only had one job and you couldn't even do that right. 0 out of 10, worst game. They've done a lot more than just fix the warp pipes in Rogueport as well. There's a few different areas throughout the game that were particularly tedious to move through due to backtracking, and they've made an active effort to try to fix them. Obviously, the biggest offender here was Chapter 4, where you'd have to do several treks through the forest to get to the only 2 areas that actually matter, and they've effectively completely solved that. There's now a nice convenient pipe within the creepy steeple that leads directly back to Twilight Town, which saves countless trips back and forth if you actually want to get to 100%. Now, I talked about this chapter before, and honestly, I don't think a warp pipe is the most elegant solution to its problem. It's a pretty obvious band-aid, but properly solving it without the pipe would require an entire rework of the whole chapter, and that was doubtless beyond the scope of what they wanted to achieve here, so it's fine. Even optional things like collecting star pieces and shine sprites is way more convenient now. There was no real good way to track your collection of these items aside from their respective shops in the original. Now, if you open up the map, you can go to any one area and check your completion percentage of each of these items in the same way that Color Splash did, which is super helpful in getting 100%, as there's a ton of really sneakily hidden star pieces that I always forget about when playing through the game. And you can even find out where they are with the hammer now. You still need the spin jump to actually flip over hidden panels that hold star pieces, but being able to know where they are prior to that is a big help, even if it only really matters for like 1.5 chapters. Now, it's not all good, however. There's one main thing that I noticed while playing that is an issue, or at least will be an issue whenever I try to play the game through again. The text speed. In the original, you could basically move through text as quickly as you wanted, which was super good for everybody. People who wanted to read all the dialogue could easily just do so, and people like me who've played the game a dozen times already could skip through stuff that didn't matter as much. You simply can't do that in the remake at all. Text boxes fill up at a constant crawl, and you can only move on to the next one once it's finished doing its thing. I really don't understand why they did this. Having the option to skip text is only only a good thing that can improve the experience for everyone, but they just didn't think about it, I guess. It's not even like they hate the idea of skipping anything, as in character for Nintendo that would be. You can skip cutscenes that play multiple times, like the cooking animation or the Glitz Pit intros. They just missed the mark on this one. And that's not actually the only thing they missed the mark on. I hate to say it, but honestly, the thing that I have the most issues with in the entire game is the combat. And no, it's not the frame rate, that's totally fine. So on the whole, it is still absolutely incredible. Thousand Year Door has one of my favorite RPG battle systems, and for all intents and purposes, it is the same system here. It's not even like the Superstar Saga remake, which kind of fused its original system with newer mechanics into some sort of Mario and Luigi chimera. This is Thousand Year Door through and through. The core mechanics being built around action commands means everything you do in battle has weight, has importance, and is interactive and fun. The way the game is balanced around very small numbers makes understanding your strength versus the enemies easy and intuitive. And of course, the badge system is incredibly versatile, giving you so many options in how you want to play the game. Do you want to use only hammer moves, only items, build up your partners to do all the work while Mario takes a vacation? You can still do all of that. The fundamentals of the system haven't changed and are still absolutely phenomenal. Yes, some things were changed. Timings for the action commands have been reworked to accommodate the lower frame rate, and that did lead to some things like super guards being noticeably easier, but honestly, I don't think it ended up being a big issue. Yes, if you're like me and know this game inside and out, you're going to have an easier time with basically everything, but raw difficulty isn't something I go to this game for, and if I did want a bit more challenge, the game still offers badges like Double Pain and Unsimplifier for challenge runs. These core changes didn't end up having any real negative effect at all. However, I do have issues with a few of the ways it was changed and brought to the remake, starting with the menuing. This is a turn-based RPG where all the actions you do are selected through menus, so it's incredibly important for that to feel snappy and responsive, since if for some reason the menus felt slow and laggy, it could kill the flow of the battle and make them feel a lot more sluggish than they should be or realistically are. Unfortunately, the menus in Thousand Year Door's remake feel slow and laggy. Now, there's a few things that go into this, like when you level up at the end of a battle, each one of Mario's attributes, HP, FP, and star power each fill up one by one before the battle fades out, which is just kind of dumb in my opinion. The thing that you're going to be experiencing the most, however, is simple lag when trying to do moves. There's been a lot of discussion as to what exactly is going on here, with people theorizing that you can't do anything while star power is charging or things like that, but I think it's a lot simpler than that. The team just made menus animate in just the wrong way, so you can't change options until the animation is completely finished, even if it looks like it should be good to go. This was a pretty constant issue for me, especially early on. The original's menus were lightning quick. I could do anything I wanted whenever I felt like it and it would always be able to keep up, but here I had to slow down and wait before even attempting to do anything at times because I knew that if I had tried too early, nothing would happen. But the thing that annoyed me the most, that completely destroyed the battle pace whenever it happened, were the hecklers. This was one of my favorite little mechanics from the original and did a ton to sell the feeling that these battles were all actually stage plays. Every once in a while, one of the live audience members will hold up an item or a rock or whatever. Whenever this happened, you had the option to Uno reverse card Will Smith here and smack him around instead if you wanted. Now, you had to pay attention to exactly who was doing what, since while it could be an X-Naut or whatever tossing a rock, it could also be a fan trying to give you a helpful item, and assaulting your fans isn't a very popular move with the crowd. The best thing about this mechanic was the fact that it was almost entirely optional, and did very little to signpost itself. You had to pay attention, and if you were tunnel visioning the battle, you could easily get yourself smacked. Whenever this happens in the remake, however, everything stops. Your menus stop working and you're forced to directly focus on it for a while, which really robs it of a lot of its fun. On top of that, if you do end up wanting whatever the audience is going to toss, all this ends up being is a 5-ish second delay before you can continue doing anything in the battle, which is so frustrating. Another weird thing I've noticed is that the stage hazards are way more common than they were in the original, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they kind of leave a bad taste in my mouth because they're so incredibly tilted in the player's favor. Like, check out this battle against the final fight in Chapter 5. This was never what I considered to be a tough battle, but the stage hazards were triggering so frequently and always landing on Crump that I didn't really need to do anything. The stage kind of just won the fight for me. I almost never got put into a position where I was in danger because of stage randomness, and I feel like this mechanic should be a lot more even-handed, especially if it's going to happen so often. I really love these little events and think they do add a ton for the overall battling experience, but man, Mario's already got a partner on stage. He doesn't need the stage to act as a second, you know? It's certainly not all bad though. There are a few changes that I do really appreciate overall. One is the game's changes to the overall economy. I wouldn't say that money was super hard to come by in the original, but you definitely couldn't just go on shopping sprees whenever you wanted to. The game is way more generous with coins now. Every boss gives a big coin reward, which is something that I have seen people complain about, but honestly, I think it's fine. There's a lot of things that are really expensive later on, especially some of the more unique build badges, and you do need that extra income if you want to be able to buy it all without tons of grinding, so I appreciate that. And frankly, it really just enables item builds a lot more, which I also am a big fan of. And Goombella's tattle ability is far more useful than it was originally. It was always useful since any enemy tattled on had its HP revealed for the rest of the game, but if you wanted to know any of its unique abilities or stats, you couldn't just do that in battle without pulling Goombella out and using tattle on the enemy again. Now there's a convenient little tattle log in the battle that lets you reread any of the tattles for any enemy in that battle for free. This can be a huge help, especially if you're heading down the Pit of 100 trials for the first time and need to know if that one spider enemy will insta-kill you or not. Spoiler alert, it will. Okay, so I've had a lot of complaints here, but I want to stress that most of these are largely nitpicks from someone who's played this game forever. Battles in the remake are largely just as fun as they ever were, and taking the gameplay as a whole, even the biggest problems I have with the remake's battle system is nowhere near enough of an issue that I would even consider it to be significantly inferior. And even if it were, the additions and changes to the exploration is more than enough to make up for it and then some. The remake is still an absolute joy to play, and the experience will probably be even better for new players that don't have any frame of reference for my minor gripes. And now I think this is the point where I'd really start talking about the story, but I'm not actually going to go into the overall story in this video. That being said, that doesn't mean there isn't a lot to talk about in this department. A lot has gone on, and it really is worth discussion. Now, if you've been paying attention to this remake at all prior to its release, you would know that there has been a bit of controversy about it, because the script is not a one-to-one recreation of the originals, at least in English. They have made some changes. In any situation like this, script changes are almost always going to be met with skepticism at best and cries of censorship at worst. Frankly, I was pretty skeptical of things myself, as Nintendo is kind of known for not having the best track record for localization. That being said, despite being a Nintendo fan, I am still open to change if things are handled correctly. So, does Thousand Year Door's remake handle its script changes correctly? Well, kind of. Let me explain. Thousand Year Door's script was really good for what it did within the Mario franchise. It told its story well, helped build a fun and full world, built up its characters in natural and engaging ways, was really funny and entertaining, and had quite a bit more edge than you'd expect it to. That's all still here, just to get that out of the way. While there have been quite a few changes, I would say that overall the script is pretty much on par with the originals, if only because the good changes managed to balance out the bad ones. For instance, there were quite a few characters that had visible accents. Most citizens of Far Outpost were quite Slavic, and Dupree spoke with a very thick French accent, for example. Pretty much every instance of this throughout the game is completely gone, everyone now having the same flat speech patterns. This is pretty disappointing, since every character with an accent benefited from that in some way, and the loss of those accents weakens the overall world building a little. And of course, at the very start of the game, just before the battle against these Goombas, it originally had the Goombas catcalling Goombella with her immediately clapping back at them. This was a cool character moment that is entirely gone from the remake. It's now a joke about the Goombas being stuck underground and being prejudiced against surface dwellers. I think this is really funny and like it a lot, but I can't help but wish we could have had both, you know? Removing the original dialogue is unfortunate because it helped build up Goombella's character and does more for the overall story than one relatively throwaway joke line. But it's certainly not all bad. There definitely are some really interesting high points here. and I guess it's about time I make up for the fact that I completely forgot about it in my retrospective video, so let's talk about Vivian. Vivian was already one of the most interesting characters in the game because unlike every other partner, she started out as part of the villain's crew, part of the Shadow Sirens to be specific. Her heel turn away from their side had nothing to do with her believing that Mario's goals were correct, it was purely because he was kind to her, which is something that her sisters had never really done. In basically every scene that we encounter the Shadow Sirens up until Vivian's betrayal, we see her being ruthlessly abused by her oldest sister, Beldam. The fact that we got to see so much of that makes us want to root for her and see her get away from that, so her joining Mario's party is a huge relief and a great positive turn for her story. It was a pretty standard tale of standing up for yourself and not letting yourself be bullied, but that's not exactly how it goes down in the remake. Yes, Vivian is still bullied relentlessly by her sisters throughout the remake, but it's given a much darker and much crueler origin. There was never any real reason given for Beldam's actions in the original, and if you wanted to be generous, you could even give her the benefit of the doubt by saying that the reason for her actions was due to her single-minded fixation on getting the Shadow Queen revived, which made her act much more harshly than she normally would. That would even kind of explain why Vivian would go back to her sisters after the Shadow Queen was defeated. That more generous take on Beldam's character simply cannot exist anymore because we get an actual reason as to why she's abusing Vivian so much. See, Vivian was apparently born as Beldam and Marilyn's brother, not their sister, but over time she realized that wasn't right for her, so she took on her current identity, one that fits her so much better. Vivian is much happier this way, but it's clear through her dialogue that Beldam wasn't so accepting and began treating Vivian significantly worse after she made her transition. So yeah, Beldam hates Vivian because she is trans. Oof. This makes Beldam's actions so much more vile and makes Vivian's choice to leave that situation all the more important. Now, I'm not the YouTuber that anyone wants or needs to go deeper into this topic and how it's handled, stuff like that. I'll leave that to people who are far more qualified, but I will say that I do appreciate that Nintendo actually did this. There's been controversy about this situation from the second the game originally released in 2004, as apparently the original Japanese script made reference to Vivian being trans, but since I can't read Japanese, all I could really do was go off other people's interpretations of that script online, and that can never end well. Regardless of whether or not that originally existed, I am pretty proud of Nintendo's localizers for actually planting their flag and making it definitive. It's a pretty cool statement that I'm sure means a lot to a lot of people, and I'm happy for them. And with all that out of the way, I guess it's about time I finally give my overall opinions on this video game here. I love it. Obviously. This is still Thousand Year Door, and even if the effort wasn't all there, it'd take a major disaster for me to end up disliking it. Thankfully, the remake is about as far from a disaster as I could have ever hoped for. It looks and sounds amazing, they've made some fantastic changes and additions to the exploration gameplay, which many people would consider its least good aspect, and while the battle system didn't make quite as smooth a jump to this new version in my opinion, the vast majority of my issues are very minor and do very little to hamper the enjoyment I get out of playing it. Thousand Year Door is absolutely one of my favorite games of all time, and this remake has only cemented that in my opinion. If anyone were to tell me that this game has completely superseded the original and they'll never go back to the Gamecube version for any future playthrough, I wouldn't fault them for that at all. I don't think it's quite that level myself. There are a few things that need to be fixed to smoothen up the experience, and I am still partial to the buttery smooth frame rate of the Gamecube version. But if some things like the battle menu speed ended up being patched, and if, say, a successor to the Switch were to release that allowed for the base game to get a frame rate boost, then I'd probably be putting my GameCube version back on the shelf for the last time as well. Regardless though, this is an amazing game and an amazing experience. One that I wholeheartedly recommend to anyone who's a fan of Mario, RPGs, and pretty much everybody else as well. New players, especially those who have experienced the more modern half of the series, will definitely be in for a treat, and Intelligent Systems has even put in some stuff for veterans to play around with as well. They've added a few new super bosses to the game, and I think they're both pretty great, although only one of them would probably end up in my top 5 bosses here. If you haven't given it a shot, you're really missing out, and now that this is over, I think I'm gonna go play through it again. Thank you all so much for watching. And just before I end the video, I want to thank my amazing paid Patreon members, R.A. Miller, Anon42, Louis G, Nick Ulrich, Adora Shark, James Fish, Michael, Mike Palomino, Isaac, drawing and stuff artist, Another, Totally Not a Droid, Lucky Wonderfish, and Ryan Powell. You're all the best. Thank you so much.